2 hours. So good evening, everybody. My name is Chris Lang.
And my name is Breanna Byrd, and we're the graduate student interns for the American Indian Resource Center, also called the AIRC, and the African American Resource and Cultural Center, which we call the ARC. These two resource centers have teamed up today to co-host this event. We want to thank each and every one of you for taking the time out of your day to join us on Zoom yet again. We're in for a treat, and we're also so grateful for the amazing and supportive community that exists between the resource centers on campus.
So for those of you who are new to events hosted by us, the ARC and the AIRC are dedicated to supporting the needs of ABC, which stands for African, Black, and Caribbean, as well as Native identified students on campus by hosting events that build community and exhibit the rich diversity of our respective cultures and experiences.
And just a bit of housekeeping, we ask that everyone disables their video and audio in order to minimize distractions and disruptions during the presentation. Tonight's event will be recorded and shared on both the AIRC and the ARC social media pages. The chat function on Zoom can be used to send messages to the hosts only. So we will share questions with our speakers using this method. So please do ask them, and we will try our best to get to as many of them as possible. But if you have any questions about phrases, themes, or something a speaker is saying during the presentation, please message us.
So our teams are present in the Zoom call today, and we'd like to give a quick shout out to our amazing directors, Chantal Thomas and Dr. Rebecca Hernandez. Woo! As well as our program coordinators and interns for all the work that they do both in front of and behind the scenes. We'd now like to read the Amamutsan Tribal Band Land Acknowledgement. UC Santa Cruz is located on the unceded territory of the Awaswas-speaking Yupi tribe. The Amamutsan Tribal Band, comprised of the descendants of indigenous people taken to missions Santa Cruz and San Juan Bautista during Spanish colonization of the Central Coast, is today working hard to restore traditional stewardship practices on these lands and heal from historical trauma.
As I said earlier, my name is Breanna Byrd. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a graduate intern at the ARC. I'm a first-year student in feminist studies, and I'm currently studying narratives of apocalypse or world ending, and I'm centering Black women's stories and adaptive strategies under chattel slavery, genocide, and dispossession, and I'm honored to be here.
And hey, y'all. My name is Chris Lang, and I use he, him pronouns. As a graduate student intern for the American Indian Resource Center this year, I've been exploring the overlaps and intimacies, histories, and struggles between Native and African Americans and how these relations can reconfigure our eco-social thoughts.
And my name is Amanda Collins. I use she, her pronouns, and I am an undergraduate intern with the American Indian Resource Center. I identify as African American, Mexican American, and I'm a citizen of the Muskogee Creek Nation. As an AfroNative student, I'm excited to see my identity represented in academia and to be part of this dialogue about the conflicts, victories, and shared experiences of Native Americans and African Americans.
In the fall quarter, Bree and I participated in a Black geography seminar offered by Professor Camilla Hawthorne. We read Dr. Tiffany King's The Black Shoals, a book that looks at the interconnectedness of Native and Black life outside of the shackling confines of conquest. Dr. King writes that she hopes her book provokes a conversation about how Black and Native communities can end this world and remake reality and its relations on more just terms.
The relationship between Black and Native peoples has looked, felt, and operated differently at various times in history, including finding refuge and engaging in conflict. We have two amazing scholars here today who have offered to share their experiences and wisdom on questions that exist at the intersections between Black and Native relations here on Turtle Island.
So first we have Professor Childs. Professor Childs is an Afro-Massachusetts tribe of Indians at Punkapoag scholar, author, and professor emeritus of sociology at UC Santa Cruz. Seeking to bridge the communities and find common ground, he coined the term transcommunality and implements these practices into his own work through the Barrios Unidos project. The term transcommunality was informed by Dr. Child's examinations of the Native American Haudenosaunee Great League of Peace, which is a pact that helped end wars among the 5 Iroquois nations in what is now upstate New York during the early 15th century.
And next we have Dr. Robert Keith Collins. Professor Collins is a scholar on African and Native American contact and cultural change, and African Native American identity, kinship, and memory, as well as an associate professor of American Indian Studies at San Francisco State University. He was a contributing co-curator of the 2009 Smithsonian Traveling Banner exhibit titled Indivisible, African Native American Lives in the Americas. A descendant of Africans and Choctaws himself, he researches the complex negotiations of self for African Native Americans in the Americas. In one article, Dr. Collins highlights the self-determination exhibited by Black Choctaws who understand their perceived race does not represent the totality of their identity, which is mediated by family, culture, and so much more.
So there's so much to discuss today, Professor Childs and Collins. But before we begin, we'd like to offer you each some time to introduce yourselves and perhaps to speak to your own personal experiences with holding identities between the streams, as you say, Dr. Childs, of Africa and the Americas. So please share a bit about your passions and research, as well as your own relationship to this event theme. And if we can begin with Dr. Collins.
Okay. Now I'm unmuted. Well, good evening, everyone, or I should say, good evening, especially if you're far away, or good morning if you're abroad. I'm Dr. Robert Keith Collins. It's a pleasure to be here and an honor to engage in conversation with Dr. Childs. He's not only someone who I like talking to, but also I look up to. In my work, I'm particularly interested in a trajectory of research that is very similar to his. I look at a process called transculturalization. That is when individuals enter culture, they are coming from their own culture, they have to decide what about the new culture they like, they don't like, and they'll internalize pieces of it and reject other pieces or form a fusion with that culture as well. And so you have a representation of the old and the new. This line of research I've done particularly in southeastern Oklahoma among African Choctaw mixed bloods, and for the Indivisible project that was brought up, my contribution was to look at this process not only in terms of this transculturalization process, but also what's in the core of that, paying attention to what people say, what they do, and what they embody in North, Central, and South America. And one thing that I found, especially for individuals who are of African and Native American descent, is they share several things in common. One, a lot of times their genealogies, and this relates to the genealogical approaches used by Melville Herskovitz and Zora Neale Hurston. Their genealogies are ways by which they keep histories that are seldom often corroborated in the written records of the different nation states within the different hemisphere, parts of the hemisphere. The second is that oftentimes they represent something to themselves that they don't represent to other people, which gets at the core, one of the core elements of doing a person-centered approach, which is at part of doing transculturalization research. And that is this embodiment oftentimes perplexes society or the public when in private, they answer the question, who am I, in ways that are related indelibly to family, community, and society. And the third is that in many cases, they actually add to these notions of African American and Native American in ways that have been forgotten, I would say, and not forgotten on purpose. They just kind of fell out of common practice in anthropological, historical, and some cases sociological research. And that is really the breadth to which, and I'll draw from particularly Montague Cobb, the breadth to which African Americans represent an amalgamation of different peoples, as well as American Indians represent, especially to draw from early works of Ella Deloria, amalgamation of not only different peoples, but also different cultures. And so the notion of being authentic, which was championed in the early 1900s by many anthropologists, was based upon a perspective that sought to create authenticity rather than have that notion reflect the realities of who people actually were. So what I like to do in my own work, and particularly the current work that I'm engaging in, is revisiting slave narratives, not in terms of just experiences of slavery, but how people talk about kinship. And one of the things we run into is a phenomenon that really is, which is why I enjoy teaching in American Indian Studies, off the radar for many people, and that is the experiences of enslaved American Indians, the people from which many African Americans get this notion that, oh, grandma and grandpa was a slave, or, oh, grandma and grandpa was a slave, but they were Indian. And while that may not be corroborated greatly in the annals of the historical record, those events, phenomena do exist. And so those narratives in many cases began to become real, not only in terms of the statements that the people were made, but also they should remind us about the realities of the fact that those narratives represent the first time anyone ever asked these individuals what it was like to be a slave and who are you, as opposed to individuals telling other folks who they are. So I think with that, I'll stop and turn it back over to our wonderful directors.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing, Collins. And Professor Childs, Dr. Childs, would you mind giving us a quick introduction on your passions and research as well?
Yes, thank you. It's an honor to be here. Thanks to all the organizers. I want to give a big shout out to the members of my tribal community in Massachusetts, the Massachusetts people at Ponkapog, and especially to Sachem Gil Sullivan, Nane Pashmakwan, Feather on the Moon. I also want to give a big shout out to my incarcerated brothers in Soledad prison, with whom I've been working for 15 years. They're members of the Samanawak group. That's the Nahuatl Mexican indigenous name for one world. They're Southeast Asian, American Indian, African American, white, you name it, they're all working together. So thanks to them. I was born in 1942 in a housing project in the Roxbury section of Boston, Massachusetts. Malcolm X, by the way, before he was Malcolm X, lived a couple of blocks away from me. He was still Malcolm Little. I didn't know him, I was a little kid. 30 miles south of Roxbury is a place called the Blue Hills. It's where my Native American maternal ancestors are from. They named themselves the Massachusetts. Massachusetts is an Algonquian word meaning massa, means big. Chusak means hill place. They're members of the Ponkapog band. Pog is pond and Ponka is clear water or sweet water. So they're the Big Hills Sweetwater people. In 1770, a number of them went up to what's now upstate New York. They were given land to use by the Oneida Native people. They created a community there along with Sampson Oakham and Mohegan people, Pequot people, people from Long Island. They called it Brothertown. In their own language, it was called Eyamwakanak, the place of equal people, designed to be a place of sanctuary, of learning, of creativity. My father's family is from Marion, Alabama, Perry County. The Childs family, after the Civil War, joined with six other African-American families to create a school for African-American teachers, to teach African-Americans to be teachers. They called that school Lincoln Normal. Many, many years later, a woman named Coretta Scott from Marion, Alabama, went to that school. She later married Martin Luther King. The school became famous for its work in African-American education. I mention all this because I realized after many years that I was following in the footsteps of my elders, my ancestors. Brothertown and Lincoln Normal School both represent places where my African-American and Native American relations formed places of creativity, of sanctuary, and strength. I see myself as a person very much like the Algonquian word Naiwichawanak that my indigenous relatives use. It means the place in between two strong currents. I thought about that once a few years ago, and it occurred to me, the place between two strong currents has its own identity. It is unique and distinct, yet it only exists because there are two strong currents on either side of it, an island, in other words. I see myself as Nywichawanic. I am not a half-breed in my own thinking, not a hybrid, not a Sambo, whatever terms are used. I mean, I'm just talking about myself. People can use whatever terms they want. And I am not half of anything. I am a complete person, a complete man in between two strong currents. But I'm only complete because of the two strong currents of Africa and Native America. So they make me what I am today, a full person. Let me just show you really quickly, if I may. That's my great-great-great-grandfather and my great-great-great-grandmother, Eli and Sloma Byrd. There's my grandmother there. They are the ancestors of the Childs Petty John family of Native Americans. And the Lincoln Normal School in Perry County, Alabama, let me just show you this. This is the several young women at Lincoln Normal School. It happens to be the Lincoln Normal School girls basketball team, 1918. I try to, in my work, to bridge and be a in-between person who can reach out to others and work with others despite differences of perspective, differences of opinion. And I've seen this work to great success in Soledad Prison. So I'm glad to be here today. I hope to be able to say a few more words, and I hope to hear a whole lot of words. Thank you.
Wow, thank you both. I think just this quick snippet of your life's work and trajectory is not even where we could begin. So, if you all have anything you want to add throughout, please do. And just for the audience so that y'all can know, please ask your questions privately to the chats. We'll be trying to put them together throughout for the Q&A later. So thank you all for that intro. And we'd like to explore some of the themes that you've touched on with a few questions of our own. And then, as I said, we'll open that up for a Q&A.
Yeah, thank you both. So I'll start with the first question to both of you, Dr. Childs and Dr. Collins. So one of the things that's been on my mind is the mixed histories of Native and African American peoples, with our communities just systematically being put at odds with each other, such as tribes owning slaves and the Buffalo Soldiers' participation in the genocide of Native tribes. But there's also this assistance to each other by providing refuge during after emancipation. So given this fraught history between our groups, how do we have a conversation about potential of our coming together while acknowledging the harm we've done in order to survive on settlers' terms?
Robert, why don't you go ahead? Start with.
I was going to say the same to you. So, okay, I'll start by really engaging this. I like this question quite a bit, particularly because it's in the current politic of, I'll say, putting people at odds with each other, that we oftentimes forget about how this history of contact actually started. It didn't really start in terms of Africans and Native Americans being pitted against one another. Africans and Native Americans found themselves in two major phenomenons. One, as fellow slaves, and particularly on the East Coast and the Southeast, this was a situation that really defined and shaped interactions and a lot of the unity that occurred. And then the second one as allies, and that can be with respect to giving specific examples, the Seminoles coming together, Africans freeing slavery, and Seminoles leaving the Creek Nation and forming a common group of the Seminole or runaways in Florida. That kind of unity, also individuals fighting against the KKK, for example, helping the Lumbee, to, in many respects, a lot of the inner city interactions you see today, especially in Oakland, California, where I'm from, where Africans and Native Americans, in some cases, are one another's common voice. And so by consequence, if we focus on that, and that's part of what, and I encourage the NMAI folk who worked on Indivisible to chime in on this, if we focus on shared identities, stories and shared culture and shared and common vision, we can actually engage a history that is over 200 years old. And that's just within the written record of the history, sociology, and anthropology. And it also taps into something that's almost 400 years old. And that is the journal and journal reports and explorer reports from individuals passing through North Carolina, South Carolina, what became Oklahoma, for example, and documenting the interactions that they saw between Africans and Native Americans, and especially individuals, later scholars like Frank Speck, who chronicled the dynamics of family composition among the Seminoles, as well as, for example, African and Native interactions among the Ojibwa, as well as Melville Herskovitz and Zora Neale Hurston, who did a genealogical approach to not only freed slaves, but also freeborn individuals of African descent, to really ask them one question: who are your grandparents and parents, and document the extent to which these individuals had African American ancestry, Native American ancestry, and how that actually came together to form a family. And for the people such as the Wampanoags, how that came together to form a community. So much so that even as early as 1880, you had, or I should say as late, especially because Wampanoag history goes way back, even as late as 1880, you had individual communities among the Wampanoag who still spoke Mende. And one of the things that this shows us is that these racial divisions that we deal with today and define how we answer the question sometimes, who am I, or who I should affiliate with, in some cases are not salient to the unity or salient in the unity that you see within the early interactions, and even some of the more contemporary interactions of folks who don't engage in that practice. So this is where I think unity, shared experience, shared culture, kinship, shared kinship can be great jumping off points for starting conversations that move us beyond division.
Thank you. I was thinking about what you were saying about genealogy and how much that illuminates my own life, and especially in the southern New England with the Wampanoag, Massachusetts, Pequot, Mohegan, you name it. The Massachusetts Ponkapaw tribe of Indians, of which I am an enrolled member, invited me some years ago. I had the good fortune to meet a couple of them at a conference, and they invited me to submit a genealogical history to see if I could be admitted as an enrolled member. And that history goes back for me 5 generations to the Massachusetts Indian Census of 1866, if I remember that date correctly. And the interesting thing there for me is that it's not about genetics, it's not about appearance, black, white, brown, whatever. It's about kinship over time and space for the Massachusetts people and for many others in southern New England, very much like what you're talking about, Robert. And if you look at if you go to the Pequot Museum in Connecticut, right? Connecticut.
Yes.
Look at the photographs of the members of the Pequot tribe, you'll see people who look black, whatever that means. People look white, whatever that means, and people look Native American, whatever that means. But it's not about appearance. They have carved out their own sense of who they are, and it involves an interaction across lines that other people think cannot be traversed. So I think the genealogy, sense of kinship over time and space are extremely important, and are not, as you say, not visible out on the street. Someone walks by and say, oh, there's a black person, there's a white person. Those genealogies back 200, 300 years, 400 years are not visible, but they are known.
Absolutely. And I just want to say thank you for bringing up Massachusetts, because I think especially when folks get interested, and especially if they're coming from, say, the lens of Africana studies or African American studies, and they'll quote Carter G. Woodson. Carter G. Woodson did some of the initial research on your folks and really got into the documentation that revolved around the interpersonal interactions that had occurred between Africans and Native Americans. And one of the things, especially among the Mashpi, you ended up with was, I think what you pointed out greatly, is that this issue of absorption is something that folks who are outside of a community pay very close attention to. But for the Wampanoags, it was not an issue. The children were celebrated in many respects. And that actually for him, coming from, you know, and if we think of Carjewitson's time, it's a racist time. And it's prior to the civil rights movement, racism is real. But even for him, that type of unity could occur was fascinating. And I think that you have pointed out something most importantly, where I mentioned the example of language and Mende was still spoken, Wampanoag was the common language of communication. And I think, especially as you pointed out, shared kinship is the common language of interaction. So when people talk, they don't say, oh, my enrolled son or daughter. They say my son, my daughter, this is my uncle, my grandma, my grandpa. And that label of racialization, that label of demarcation as other is seldom part of that conversation, unless if someone's using it to their benefit. And my folks are from Oklahoma. So Oklahoma, as you all know, has a lot of excitement when it comes to racism and interactions, but also underneath that surface, there is a love in families that transcends all of that racial yakety schmackety, as I like to call it, where people are using words just to make others feel bad or make them feel like they are outside of a parameter. And in some of those families, just like we brought up on East Coast with Carnegie Woodson, you have individuals who are still speaking Creek. I run into people in my field work who still speak Cherokee, and one looks full blood, the other one looks black. But Cherokee has been spoken in their families since they were born and before. So this is where I think a good conversation is really forming, where you can not only wed the familial to the academic, but also I think especially for American Indian Studies, which I'm teaching in now, really begin to show the breadth of interpersonal interactions that American Indians engaged in before blood quantum and enrollment and a lot of the politic that individuals focus on today. And that even when they do focus on it today, sometimes the families just kind of go, ha, 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 and still say, this is my son, my daughter, this is my uncle, my auntie, even though people may not look like each other, so to speak.
Wow. Thank you both for sharing. It's so fascinating. And I think it also segues into the question that I have. Just wanted to give a quick reminder, if folks have any questions that they'd like to ask, we have a question and answer session for the latter portion of this event. So feel free to chime in the chat. But here's my question. In the introduction of her and Dr. Taya Miles' edited compilation called Crossing Waters, Crossing Worlds, the African Diaspora in Indian Country, which features one of your essays, Dr. Collins. The co-editor, Dr. Sharon P. Holland, says, my grandfather's mother was an Indian from Alabama. He left Georgia one day and passed for Black the remainder of his life. And this phenomenon, what some have called the native grandmother complex, is fairly common in Black households through oral tradition. And my question is, why is that so? I'm wondering if you could each unpack some of the racial dynamics that went and still go into claims of indigeneity, and share how you see rescuing some of these AfroNative histories might influence our modern efforts to bring Black liberation and indigenous revitalization.
This is a great question, and forgive me if I nerd out on you a little bit, because when Dr. Holland wrote this, I'm like, you sound just like Zora Neale Hurston, who said, I'm probably one of the few African Americans or Negroes at that time who needs to tell you that my grandfather was an Indian. One of the things that this gets at, and this is actually part of my current research, is the importance of, and I'll channel my inner Theta Purdue, the importance of taking what people say as real before you dismiss it. And the reason for that is because this issue of kinship has never really been reconciled. in terms of slavery. And I'll focus on slavery because that's my current project. So as I mentioned before, you have in these slave narratives, especially collected by the WPA between 1936 and 1938, you have examples of individuals talking, not only in terms of, and for those of you who want a synthesized book, Patrick Mingus' book is amazing on this, but also go to the Library of Congress, because then you also have, there's even more. These were ones he just accepted. But in these narratives, you have explicit explanations of one of the least under-researched phenomenon, and that is what were the Indian origins of slaves, or the American Indian origins of slaves, and to what extent were slaves American Indian. In these narratives, you have individuals like Felix Lindsay talking about his parents. His father is Creek, his mother is a quarter Creek and 3/4 Negro. You have others, for example, like Spence Johnson, who is, you can clearly see in his pictures, and we use this in the Indivisible exhibit, you can clearly see he's mixed with African American, but he doesn't identify as an African American. He identifies as Choctaw. But his family sold into slavery in Shreveport, Louisiana. And this raises the question, how was Native blood injected into African or slave families? Or how did it become part of that? And this is just one phenomenon. I'll nerd out on the East Coast later. But this brings us to, I think, that phenomenon you're getting at is what would motivate African Americans to say, my grandmother was an Indian? Part of that motivation is there is truth to this story. When you read these slave narratives, individuals talking about their mothers who are enslaved Cherokee, or their fathers who are enslaved Creek, are talking about the enslaved experiences of Native Americans and what it was like to be fellow slaves, to borrow from Porter, to be in a blended family in servitude, and what that common kinship looked like, what that shared culture looked like, who, as far as parents, suppressed one aspect of family life. And for many, I'm finding in research, American Indians usually were not allowed to speak their language, just like African Americans weren't allowed to speak their language. However, within the family, especially if it's from a matrilineal group like Cherokee or Chickasaw or Choctaw, the mother suppressed their language, her language usage, for the sake of allowing English to be the language of communication for her children, because she did not know if they would stay or be sold. And as these individuals interact, especially with people like Spence Johnson, who goes on to tell you that I'm a Negro and I'm only a Negro now to many people, or Cheney Richardson, who points out that, you know, I'm just what they call a native Negro, and marries other African Americans who migrate into Indian Territory or later the state of Oklahoma. This blending is actually creating that Indian grandmother that we hear about so much. And this is actually why it's important, and especially for those of you, either whether you're in Africana studies or American Indian studies, to really consider, and especially anthropology and sociology, consider revitalizing the genealogical approach created by Melville Herskovitz, with a heavy influence of his research assistant, Zornil Hurston. We like to talk about her in terms of literature and, she had great books, but she's an ethnographer before she does that. And this will let you see the extent to which we can actually discover whether or not this Indian grandmother was real. Now, on the genetic part, which a lot of folks like to do with genealogy, the many genealogical resources that are online today, folks like to get a DNA analysis and say, whoa, no, and they'll get the results back that says, oh, no, you're not Native American. And I would urge everyone to think of two things that are very important. One is the former, which is kinship derived. The other, and especially with this notion that was raised by our through your wonderful introductions, individuals who were enslaved in Native America were culturally American Indian. They spoke the language. They practiced the culture. They cooked the food. You have wonderful examples in the slave narratives of individuals who were present during the creation or the negotiation of where the town of Tahlequah, which is the capital for the Cherokee Nation, should be located. Two individuals in those slave narratives, and for those of you who are interested, I can send you those or send you links to it. They were serving water during these discussions, listening to what was going to happen. And mind you, they point out something else that's very exciting. They recount what it was like to be removed. So for those of you who are interested in apocalyptic discourse, this would be one area where I would say blow this out of the water, because on this trail of tears for the Cherokee, or the long walk for the Choctaw, or the long migration for any of the many other groups east of the Mississippi that were removed to what we now refer to as the state of Oklahoma, the memory of this was not just an Indian phenomenon. There were the slaves who were remembering this. And the exciting part, I think, for me, research-wise, is to bring these stories back to life. When folks go, oh no, they weren't there. Yes, they were. And one person who's doing great genealogical research is Angela Walton Raji, bringing forward the importance of not looking for the feather or looking for the Indian, but the lived experiences that created the narrative within someone's family that says, this is what happened. And perhaps why, especially if one is, from a racist environment, or an environment where people just don't want to talk about this history. And there are many people who don't want to hear what we're talking about today. They will ignore it research-wise, and then it becomes myth and folklore. I would urge us to look for that truth, revitalize interest in it, so that we pay dues to these individuals who, and I'll just say this candidly, if American Indians encourage people to pay very close attention to the origin stories of their people and respect it, these are origin stories also that must be respected. And this is where we can have a common conversation about where we have shared concern about the importance of our creation stories and our origin stories that were not corroborated by the historical record or anthropological record or sociological record. And also our relatives who experienced this, or if they were your ancestors or your people your grandma grew up with, they weren't necessarily lying. They were only lying based in a perspective that left out their own lived experience.
Robert, that's a beautiful statement, and it's very important. It seems to me that, Chris, to have a really what I would call a transcommunal communication about these issues, you have to do several things. One of them is, I've learned this from the Haudenosaunee model of peacemaking, is to listen. Listening is a wonderful thing. It's necessary. There's almost a little bit too much, the talking heads on TV. You hear a lot of talking, and you hear a lot of silence as people listen. And listening is related to respect. Respect for complexity, respect for what people have in them. And in that sense, I would say what Robert, you just said, is the basis for a transcommunal dialogue in which people, first of all, look for and then listen to the stories that you're talking about. Then we can move on, Chris, to what do we do now? What is the next step? But let's recognize it first. It has to be seen, it has to be heard, it has to be felt. And that's what Robert, it seems to me, is offering a very, very important manifesto here of seeking and listening. So that's my transcommunal take on that, is that let's listen to Robert. Use that as the foundation.
I'd say listen to Dr. Child before you listen to me, because I drew from him in his work. And especially in this notion of transcommunal, what he really did was give life to a phenomenon that really was excluded, I think, from historical analyses and anthropological analyses. I think sociological, especially like Bruton Berry, captured it when you start to look inside of families and see the inconsistencies between family understandings of being and belonging and group, I'll say ethno-racial group dimensions of being and belonging, and who gets accepted, who gets rejected. But in that transcommunal, I think especially for today, that's extremely important because of how people are asked to identify, because of the rules and regulations associated with enrollment, as well as being and belonging in the Black community. And as someone from Oakland, as I mentioned before, we have wonderful ways of determining who's really Oakland and who's not. So one of the things that should encourage us to do is to reach across those shared lifeways, to ask ourselves in many respects, and this is to draw from Dr. Child's work, where do we have common ground? And how do we build on it? And let that be the central focus rather than the divisions, I think, that have, in some cases, served our history well. It pointed out the uniqueness of folks, but especially in this conversation, it really left out things like slave agency and American Indian cultural impact, not just on African Americans, but particularly through those individuals. And I'll use the Muskogee Creek example. You had I'll just leave it general. Muskogee Creek examples where you had incredible leaders who were the translators to US society. And those individuals actually enabled the United States to understand the Muskogee. And it's in those kind of dialogues that we can really begin to see more so our common goals, more so our common and shared experiences, both past and present, than this division that really has, in some cases, done us a disservice.
Wow, thanks you both for sharing that. And I really appreciate you bringing it back into the transcommunal principles. We have one more question from Bree.
Hi, y'all. And just for folks who are joining us, who are first timers, if you have questions about anything that the speakers have said thus far, any of the terms that are in our questions, et cetera, please message them to someone that's listed as a host or co-host like myself or Chris. And then in about, I guess, like 12, 15 minutes, we'll get into the Q&A portion. So please start typing quickly so we can add y'all's questions to our list. And then my question is about bringing this back to the present moment of COVID-19. So I actually want to talk about how Black and Native communities are being disproportionately affected through death and risk. And for me, and so these are, for example, Black Americans make up 25% of the deaths from COVID in the United States, though they make up under 13% of the populations. And for Indigenous peoples, the rate of COVID-19 cases per 1,000 was more than 4 times higher for the population residing on the res than for those in the United States as a whole. And then to add to that, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez tweeted, "The chronic toll of redlining, environmental racism, the wealth gap, et cetera, are underlying health conditions. Inequality is comorbidity. COVID relief should be drafted with the lens of reparations." So I wanted to ask y'all, and this is here on the screen for you, what ways does this reveal places for renewing healing practices, and also demonstrate the ways, demonstrate how entangled our lives are, especially when it comes to economy, industry, and health?
I'll let you go, Dr. Child.
Okay, thanks, brother. One of the institutional areas where you see this impact of COVID-19 so starkly is in the prisons. Prisons are tremendously enclosed places, to put it mildly, prisons and jails. People are stuck in the same spaces, and there's not much room for the social distancing, if any. So I'm very worried. I'm very concerned about the people I know who are in the California prison system. I'm concerned about the sisters and brothers in all the prisons and jails. Let's just take one example here. In Montana, Native Americans make up 6.5% of the population. 20% of the men in the state prisons in Montana are Native American, and 34% of the women in prison are Native American. So this is it's impacting all our populations here, and it's needs to be, I think, focused on is one aspect of the way in which COVID-19 is hitting people who are from populations that have been economically, socially, and politically marginalized over many centuries. The other thing I was thinking, Breanna, I think I mentioned this to you yesterday when you described your work on apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic issues. For Native American people, and certainly for Africans who were ripped off the continent of Africa and brought to the Western Hemisphere, the apocalypse started in 1493. And for my Native ancestors in Massachusetts, The apocalypse started after 1617, when smallpox, introduced as a disease, smallpox just decimated most of the Massachusetts people. They went from a population of around 25,000, roughly estimated, to about 600 in the space of like 20 years. That they survived today, that they are so resilient and so creative, is a testimony to their own integrity of spirit that includes African and Native American together, as Robert has mentioned. It is certainly to their credit, to our credit, but the apocalypse was a rolling phenomenon, hitting the East Coast, North America, South America, Central America, and working its way west, south, north, up to the Arctic, down to Tierra del Fuego. It was the rolling apocalypse. And we've been in that post-apocalyptic situation for centuries now, from my point of view, for Native peoples and for African peoples. So I'd like to just put the current situation, which is distressing and terrible, and I wish we had better, let's say, leadership around the country, but we do have it in many places. But still, that apocalyptic, rolling apocalypse has been going on for a long time, and I think it helps us to understand what's happening now.
I think Dr. Childs touched on something very important, and that is the shared experiences in disease. I think one of the things we can do is evoke the notion of Sankofa. It's talked about a lot in African American studies and looking backwards, and for American Indian studies, really looking to the past to learn. And if we do that, one of the things I think comes up in what Dr. Childs has said is the importance of looking at how people coped with diseases in the past. Our most recent one that we have, especially that adds a lot of weight to dealing with COVID, is the influenza epidemic in 1917, 1918. And one of the things that's really important to remember about that time is that many individuals, not just men, but also women, were returning from World War I, where they had fought a war, especially if you look at Choctaw Code Talkers, you look at Harlem Hellfighters, they're coming back from having fought a war to be impacted and really knocked down in some cases by influenza, much like the communities that they were coming from. And in those experiences, just like Dr. Childs pointing out, people are disproportionately experiencing these diseases. And I think for today, this can give us not only a way of looking back, but strategies for moving forward. One of the things, and this actually ties into the previous question, and I promised Mr. Lang I won't talk too long, but when you asked especially, where can we have common conversation? One of the ways in which people remedied or found remedies from influenza was with food. And I saw some of my Creole colleagues online and in foods, for example, such as the one pot. And I'll leave that because the famous one is gumbo. And yes, there are multiple types of gumbo. There's African American or Creole gumbo. There's, let's just put it this way. There's red, white, and black gumbo. And each of those gumbos serve a particular purpose. And especially in the utilization of cayenne, wild onions, and wild garlic, those foods were basically put together in a way that allowed for people to not necessarily recover from influenza, but to help fight it. And this is where I would encourage us to really look into the transcommunal discourse created by Dr. Childs and ask ourselves, what are those common foods, for example? What are those common home remedies that we have to deal with disease today? I think one of the things that we will begin to see, especially for those of you from the Southeast, teas like sassafras have been used ad nauseum, and I won't say that's just necessarily Southeast. Northeast has that too. Eastern woodlands. In the Southwest, you have, among the Pueblos, you have an Indian tea. In the Northwest, you have many, many different teas made from various different plant materials. And in thinking about, for example, the revitalization of native foods done by some of my colleagues, especially at SF State, one of the things we can see is that looking backwards can actually teach us how to create strategies for now. so that COVID is not something that we should just freak out and panic about. We actually have, in some cases, the arsenal that was inherited from ancestral teachings, perhaps, or even within anthropological and historical documentation that we can draw from in order to create remedies. But especially as Vine Deloria pointed out, one thing that it becomes really important to do is to engage in comparative explanations and analyses of what each of us are going through. And that whether that be in tribal communities or the urban environment, within African Native American families or African American and Native American families respectively, that can really give us a sense of how we can engage this and really move towards an outcome that is positive, much like those who experienced the influenza outbreak did before. So I tried to pack a lot of stuff together, and I'll turn it back over to Dr. Child.
Yeah, just a couple of short comments. First of all, let me apologize. Robert, you and I have known each other for a long time. So I call you Robert.
No, my folks are Southern. I can't call you by your first name.
Oh, okay. Thank you. I just want to make sure that was clear. I was just thinking about history. And one of the senses that word conjures up often is that something in the distant past. My mother died at 105 years of age a few years ago, several years ago. When she was a young woman, Geronimo was still alive. W.B. Du Bois and Ida B. Wells were active young adults working in the movement for liberation of African Americans. So I am the child of a woman who is a young girl, was alive when Geronimo, Ida B. Wells, and W.B. Du Bois were active. Even though it sounds like a long time ago, and it is. I mean, 1942 when I was born seems like a long time ago, and it is, but in some ways it isn't. There's such thick connection to the generations preceding and the people I knew. My grandmother was born when Geronimo was active, really active. So we're talking about history, but we're also talking about living history, not that which is stultified.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think this is where, in a lot of cases too, that comes through in your work as well as mine. I think that's where we have shared ground. The importance of talking to elders and using that elder knowledge, not in terms of, oh, this is what grandma told me to do, or grandpa, he just made me mad, so I need to listen to what he said. No, what are the strategies, the life strategies that they engaged in that actually enabled them to live through these times? And so thinking about the time in which your mother lived and her relatives, that is a time also where influenza came back again. Yeah, German measles came through. So there were a lot of diseases that came through at that time that we can really, in some cases, if those folks are still with us in form of their children, we can really find out a lot of knowledge that, in some cases might just be taken for granted. I know I interviewed someone from the Pacific Northwest who's half African-American, half Tlingit. And it was funny, during finals time, he just pulled out this tea and he's like, oh yeah, my grandma used to make it, and it has seaweed in it, so it helps me whenever I get sick. And lo and behold, it has a ton of vitamin C and other things that we could go scientific about. But just that knowledge actually enabled him to cope, because he was a poor student like many of us were in school, and allowed him to cope with those diseases. And if we draw from that knowledge, it's a wealth of information that really remains open to new discovery once again. And it's not that long ago. There were no pterodactyls, no brontosauruses, so not that long ago at all. And I hope to look like you so I'll ask you what you've been eating, because when I get there, I want to look like that.
Thank you both. I definitely agree about this, the taking very seriously. Many worlds have ended many times under our current sort of like scenario of settler colonialism, et cetera, however you want to name it, with our community members here. So I think Amanda has the transition for our first set of Q&A? Yes. So, but thank y'all, and I love that. So yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you both of you for just talking about commonalities and like demonstrating it right now by talking about learning from our elders. Like, yeah, just thank you for being in this space. So right now in this stage of the event, we'd like to open up for some questions from our participants. Thank you to everyone who has already submitted questions, and we will try to get through as many as we can in this period of time. So our first question goes, I'd like to ask what kind of questions about the archive the speakers have encountered during their work in terms of diverse forms of knowledge and regarding AfroNative shared history and relations. I suppose like different types of knowledge.
Yes, absolutely. Dr. Childs, you want to take this one?
No, you go first, man.
Okay. I'm sorry if I put you in a wind tunnel. And to everyone who is listening, if you have not, the first archive that I would say go to actually is your local vital statistics office or county courthouse, because that is where you can find a lot of information about local African and Native American interactions. The second is your university library, especially if you have interlibrary loan, using the archival entity, like at Berkeley, it's Bancroft Library. At SF State, for example, it's the Sutro Library. Using that kind of archival entity is important. And next, if you've never done it, and we've talked a lot about the United States, if you're interested in anything related to early United States, and that is when it was divided between England, Spain, and France, go to Los Archivos de las Indias in Sevilla, Spain. One of the things you will find is African and Native American interaction. Actually, thank you to Dr. Russ, who, my mentor, who forced me to go there before I finished my dissertation. One of the things that will expose you to is the breadth of African and Native American contact throughout the Western Hemisphere. This is including the Caribbean, islands like Bermuda, as well as, and this is where it's quite fascinating, the interactions that people like Filipinos had with African and American Indian mixed bloods, as well as Africans and American Indians respectively. So individuals who were under Spanish territory, individuals who interacted with people like De Soto, individuals who really observed the earliest contacts between the peoples and what that meant to the Spanish crown. In the United States, we have 5 ethnic categories. In Mexico, Central and South America, they have way more than 5. In Brazil, they just keep making them up as they go along past 12. And so one of the exciting things about that is you not only see how people play with skin color and what skin color means in their lives, but most importantly, especially for the formation of the Western Hemisphere as the new world, you can see how these interactions created new peoples that needed a classification in order to be understood. So those are 3 major areas that I would really encourage anyone who's interested in this phenomenon to go see and engage in, particularly because it will expose you to not only the histories, but given the richness of the area they're covering, the dynamics of reach that this topic actually has beyond just African and Native American interactions sometimes.
And thank you. One book I would like to suggest for everyone to read is this book by Jack Forbes,
Yes.
the great indigenous Powhatan scholar. It's called Africans and Native Americans, the Language of Race and the Evolution of Red-Black Peoples. And he certainly went through the archives.
Yes, he did.
He went through them and read them upside down, backward and forward. It's a wonderful book and a great way to start if you're thinking about archival work. And let me just tell you a short story. Many, many years ago when I was working on my dissertation at State University of New York at Buffalo, I went down to New York to the Schomburg Center to go through their archives, which at that time had not been, there was no, this is pre-internet, right? So things were in boxes. There were a lot of manuscripts in boxes. And as I was rummaging around, I found a typescript by the great African-American Puerto Rican scholar Arturo Schomburg. It was a 20-page typescript. Robin, I'll make a copy of it and send it to you.
Oh, thank you, sir.
On African-American cooking and food. And I've never seen it published. I make some reference to it in the Transcommunality book, but it's one of the joys of doing archival work is that you don't really know what's there till you get into it. And it is an amazing exploratory experience to do archival work like that.
Absolutely. And I'll have to mention the Schomburg too. I'm just getting into that now, but they have Kenneth Porter's papers. And he gave us the binary by which to really, aside from slave and citizen like Henry Tannenbaum, he gave us another binary to look at, which I evoked earlier, and that is shared experiences between Africans and Native Americans as allies and as fellow slaves. And I think going into his papers, which haven't been published from what I understand, can really be a gold mine for research. And thank you for that. I'll send you pie.
Cool. Okay, I'm gonna post the next question. It's from another professor at the intersections of African Native American studies. And this professor asks, I would like to hear the speakers address how recent scholarship like the Black Shoals and fictions of Land and Flesh by King and Rifkin tend to talk about Black and Indigenous relationships as interconnected, but not necessarily about Black and Indigenous peoples. So how do we center specific experiences of Black and Indigenous populations like the Lumbee, Pequot, Creole, Mashpee, etc., and focus on Black Indians without a and how does a focus on Black Indians without a focus on white Indians make Black Indians seem like another type of Indian? Sorry, I was just trying to.
Yeah, no, I like this question. Would you like me to start? Okay, I would say in terms of disaggregating the two, I don't think it's possible. Most of the works that were cited, I think those perspectives were presented merely for the purposes of analysis. And having read Rifkin's work, for example, I know that central focus of analysis to really kind of showcase the interactions is to really get people to think about the dynamics of interpersonal interactions that have occurred over time. Because when individuals say this notion of Black Indians, and if you bring up, for example, the Lumbee and the Pequot, and even, for example, like individuals who are Homo or Chitimacha in Louisiana, one of the things that without that kind of explanation, it can lend the illusion that these individuals are making up a history as they go along. When in reality, we need to understand those interpersonal interactions and that dynamic relationship between Africans and American Indians, so we don't lend the illusion that there's some, to borrow from Claudio Sant, there's some natural affinity between Africans and Native Americans, that people just see one another and run and go, oh yes, let's make common, culture and common identity and shared kinship. That's really not how it happens. And especially for those groups like the Lumbee and in Louisiana in particular, those interactions have been occurring over hundreds of years. And it's important to understand that as interactions based on longevity, so that we don't, for example, lend the illusion that they are just creating their identities today to be part of the native trend, so to speak, or to move away from Blackness, as some people have accused them of being. It's important to understand why people come together. And I think the works that were pointed out, Black Shoal in particular, is really showing how this came about. And I find it to be the other side of the coin that I'm on, that looks at African Native American lived experiences, because then you know how, for example, maybe their parents interacted or their grandparents interacted, or those interpersonal interactions that were necessary to produce those individuals of blended ancestry, either racially or culturally, that the notion Black Indian embodies and represents.
And let me just pick up on a key word that you just used, which is dynamic. Everything we've been talking about so far, it seems to me, is about fluidity, dynamic, interaction. It's not about boxed in categories. It doesn't mean that people don't have a sense of gravity in one place and other people have a sense of gravity in another. But there's a lot of movement in this. The Black Shoals is about water. Naiwichiwanik is about the two strong currents. So there's movement. And it's sometimes I think in academia we're still stuck with the Linnaean classification system, which is fine in some ways, but it's static. And we're looking at a lot of dynamic effervescence in the stories that we're talking about.
And to draw on what Dr. Childs just said with this notion of white Indian, that dynamic is as fluid as that of Black Indian, and it's just a different admixture. There, in many cases, are the same problems in interaction, the same racisms between the people. And one thing that I think is really important, and this happened in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, and I think we've just forgotten it. And you can see it especially in the works of A.F. Chamberlain, as well as it's to some extent an individual, Lawrence Foster, that many people don't know. He started off as an anthropologist and became one of the contributors to Black sociology. These were individuals who really talked about, in many cases, and A. Irving Hollowell as well, thinking about American Indian, not in terms of the tribe or the authentic, but in terms of how the nation state has created variations in Indianness. And so Hollowell's work, for example, American Indian in Black and White, really gets at the similarities and differences between the white Indian and the Black Indian, but also really focuses on these are, like I mentioned before, two sides of the same coin. In many respects, they just represent the racial binary in the United States, and shows not only the adaptation of American Indians to it, but the extent to which, and we don't like to talk about this as historians and scholars, to which people found love the best way that they could. And it produced children that did not look like their original ancestry. And so in many respects, I would encourage us, while sometimes, and yes, my folks, for example, are from Oklahoma. My grandmother was born in Idabel, and it is a wonderful town, but it can be incredibly racist, just like much of the rest of the South. One thing I would encourage us to do, rather than just becoming defensive against that, whiteness as Black Indians or American Indians and saying, oh, they're racist, is look at the conditions of the people and the dynamics of interactions that they've had to deal with. Because I think one of the things in Black Shoal that is really illuminated, and definitely in Rifkin's work, is the importance of paying attention to how people navigate these dual currents, to draw from Dr. Childs, and what that navigation requires. If we look, for example, at much of Oklahoma today, the vast majority is white and Native mixed blood. If we look at a lot of, I'll say, tribal groups west of the Mississippi, the majority interaction is white and Native. And I will pose the audience a question. Are those experiences of those white and Native mixed bloods very different from those exemplified and discussed by people like Forbes before us? And well, Dr. Childs got to call him a contemporary. And then those who were even before them, such as Hollowell and Chamberlain and Foster and Woodson. Are these individuals experiencing something completely different? And if not, then what can we learn about those common experiences in terms of racism that can cause us to suppress, or if possible, our intergroup racisms and find a common ground? So I think on the notion of white Indian, all we're doing in many respects is the exact same thing. And this is not me, this is Lawrence Foster talking. It's the exact same thing that you see being done with Black Indians, except there's just a different skin color and ancestry of issue. One had power, the other one didn't. I hope that answers the question. I promised I wouldn't nerd out on everybody, but but I really like the books that the professor brought up. So.
Thank y'all. I'm always excited to have people nerd out. I think it brings more to the conversation. Reminder, please keep sending in questions to us. Anybody listed as a co-host, we're adding them to a document and mushing them together to ask as many of them as possible. And so one of the questions that I have now, that's a couple of questions from a couple of folks, is sort of like about that sort of very visible experience about with Blackness and not being in power. So some folks say, what would you say to Afro-pessimists who feel that Indigenous sovereignty leaves no space for Black folks? And like the second question to that is, what cautions or excitements do you have that come from opening up more dialogues between these communities? Is the goal more about existing with intentional, nuanced ethics of care and collaboration, or attempting to dissolve rigid delineations altogether? And then if none of those suit your fancy, and that for those who aren't well versed in this history of enrollment that you all kind of unpacked in the beginning, could you just explain like the benefits or non-benefits for tribal enrollment for people of African descent? So yeah, kind of like digging more into the tensions of like anti-Blackness. And I think another question will be later kind of thinking about how to confront those two realities. Thank y'all.
Robert, you want to go?
I should let you. I should let you go first, sir.
Well, one of the interesting things about enrollment, and I'm not an expert in this, is the emphasis, the old emphasis on so-called blood quantum, or it gets to, now it's DNA perhaps, and really, again, it's very static. I mean, it's a quantum, it's a piece, right? Whereas what we've been talking about, it seems to me, and what Robert is so brilliant at is showing us the way in which people's actions, their consciousness, and their interactions make affiliation and identity happen, or sometimes maybe not happen. But it's what really has gone on is something much more fluid than the blood quantum aspect, which go, by the way, for people who don't know it, I mean, blood quantum is related to historically certain groups saying you can be a member, you can't be a member. But as I suggested with the Massachusetts Ponkapaw people, of which I am an enrolled member, it is not about blood quantum, it's not about genetics at all, it's about kinship over time. So that's one aspect of it, I think.
And I'm going to jump on one point that was raised by Dr. Childs, and that's action. And to your question, getting people to resolve their racial issues, for me, and I've studied psychology. I have racist friends that were racist first, and then they became my friend, and they weren't racist anymore because I don't tolerate it. But one of the things that I've seen is that action is at the core of getting people to see their common ground. And one of the exciting parts of getting at that common ground is you can really start to see, and this is something I teach in my class on Black Indians in the Americas, is that individuals who are doing the self-discovery, they will find, especially if they attempt to enroll in the nation, that individuals will come looking for them sometimes as cousins and individuals who they're related to and where they have, and want to know where they've been. This is a leftover, I think, also post-slavery for many African Americans who will walk past one another and have the same last name, but then not ask a question like, how did you get that name? And I know, for example, my father's from New Orleans. You walk by someone with the last name Collins, you got to ask that question, especially if you're out hanging out and you're going, oh, this person looks good. However, no, that's my uncle, and no, we can't. We're just going to have dinner and drinks, and that's it. So, but the point of that is, one of the things that action requires people to do is to really engage with one another, to push beyond prejudices, and to really get at what I think is missed in this notion that there is no space for Blackness in this discussion of American Indians. American Indian cultural impact, and this was something that was studied between 1890 and 1940. One of the first is A.F. Chamberlain's work on the impact of American Indians on civilization. This notion of American Indian impact on African American culture and vice versa has been long studied. It has only fallen out, and this was Foster who brought this up, it has only fallen out of attention as the racial divide between American Indians and African Americans was made necessary. And I'll use a couple of examples. One of the most important, especially for those who have folks from Oklahoma, is the state charter of Oklahoma. It gave the status of white people to American Indians, which meant that individuals who were members of sovereign nations, and American Indian nations are sovereign, could not They could affiliate in private. Publicly, all individuals of African descent were Black. And this was funny because if you went into Texas, you could be Indian in your family in Oklahoma. Once you cross that border, you were Black or Negro. And this is important. When we engage in this action that Dr. Childs mentioned, we force ourselves to confront history, the ways in which policies have created the sort of matter-of-fact notions that we may hold internally. And it's also in that action that we are, in some cases, challenged to question it. So our ethics in terms of adhering to national standards to make sure that citizenship is determined by the sovereign nation, yes. However, there comes a question in that action also. To what extent might that sovereignty perpetuate the racism imposed by another sovereign entity? And these are questions that are very hard. Some folks find it very difficult to answer. But I think it's when we engage this, and sometimes it's just interpersonally, we can begin to see, and that's why I brought up the examples I did before, that we can transcend these boundaries. These boundaries have been transcended before. And the research of all the individuals I mentioned before, or the lives that informed the research, I should say, of the people I've mentioned before. And one thing that we can draw from it today is the importance of revisiting where Blackness has a space in Indianness. Now, for individuals who say that we don't want that and we don't need it, and those folks do exist, it's the same as folks who say COVID is not going to affect me and I don't have to wear a mask, and then they walk out and protest and then they test positive. One of the things we learn from that is that's a given. People may think what they want. Nations will determine their citizenship. And especially for African Americans questioning positionality and place or being and belonging in Native America, I would just ask, as a person of descended from some of the first Africans from Virginia, in our Americanness, have we ever been included completely? And what have we had to do in order to show we belong? It's in those two questions that, as you hopefully see as young scholars or just young day everyday folk who are interested in this question, and especially today, given the government that we have, this is not something that is given to people. This is a history that has to be lived, told, retold, revisited, reapplied, and then formulated and then become part of a question or answer to the question, who am I? And so with that space has always been there. And there's documentation of it being there for over 400 years, not only in the United States, but in Mexico, Central and South America, who actually received the majority of Africans. We only had 500,000 come to what we now refer to as the United States. The rest of the other 14.5 million that didn't, those who didn't drown, went to Mexico, Central and South America. And it's in that we have the answer, I think, to our question, and that we just need to remember the space, just like we remember ancestors. Retell the stories, revisit the stories, question them. But that racism can't be the central focus of our definition of being and belonging. I hope that made sense.
Yes, thank you so much. To both of you. Our next question is, how can a bridge be created between members of the Academy and members of the large descendant community of researchers? How do we mend the current disconnect between the two, since extensive, in-depth, and introspective research is done among descendants?
Well, let me head for that one a little bit. The group that I work with inside Soledad prison is called Barrios Unidos, and it was created by a man named Nani Alejandros many years ago. I've been with them now as a volunteer for about almost 30 years, and the prison work I've been doing has been for about 15 years. One of the expressions Nani uses when we go in to Soledad and any other prison is, we're going to see our relations. And everyone in there with whom we work, those are our relations. Those are our people. regardless of their appearance or what group they come from, they are all our kin. And it takes a lot of work to do that. It takes a lot of work. But the sense of commonality that does not obliterate, in other words, not the commonality of the melting pot, but the commonality of humanness, that does not obliterate distinctions, but which recognizes that the distinctions can interact and have interacted, as Robert has so brilliantly said, over many, many decades. So there already are bridges there. I mean, bridge building is kind of difficult because if you have people yelling at you on both sides, then you're more like an island than a bridge. But bridge building is a lot of work, both intellectually and socially and personally. The great peacemaker, the Ganawida, who brought the message of peace to the 5 warring nations of the Mohawks, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Seneca, and Cayuga, was asked by a wonderful woman whom he went to see with his message of peace, let me just back up. She said, your message of peace is good, but what form will your words take when they come to work in the world? And it's that work in the world that we're talking about here. And we know you can do the work because you're already doing it. And it's so important to work at what Robert is talking about, work at the opening up of the ears and the eyes to these great stories. They have been subdued by the society, by the state.
And I'll piggyback off of that and say, for most of the everyday scholars or amateur scholars, they're doing some incredible work. And I wonder where this question comes from, because it sounds like a conversation I had over Facebook recently. But the importance of that is that I think one of the things that's necessary is asking the question that both the scholar and the everyday, the academic and the everyday scholar can find common ground on. And I'll give you an example. When I worked on the Smithsonian exhibit, one of the things that we had as the curatorial team was a community team check. So that meant there were members from various communities, Akona, Mashpee, and other tribal groups that were really there to check the work that we were doing. But also one of the things that they did in that check was they asked questions. And especially for academics, I'll speak for myself, I love questions. So if you ask me a question such as, and I kind of gave it to you earlier, where did these, Indians that these slaves are talking about come from? Who were these people that who were these Africans who first interacted with the Wampanoag? That's a question, as you've seen, I'll probably nerd out on you, but then also I'll return that question back and say, what have you found? And I think it's in that kind of dialogue that you get a shared analysis on the topic. One that really engages the archival records and the historical records in a way that has probably not been revisited as we did with the Smithsonian exhibit, but then also that community voice that can link the historical and the everyday today, or at that time in 2007, for example, the everyday that can really inform the academic work in ways that, and I'll just be honest, I would have never thought about before. These people I'm talking about historically, that, for example, still spoke Mende in their town, their children are now asking, can they be included in the exhibit? Or their grandchildren, great, in the exhibit. And this now turns history into something tangible. So we're all, in many respects, by virtue of that, we can become living history. And I think for the academic, it then raises other questions. And especially for me as a teacher, I'm not at a research university. What I want to do is bringing in my classroom the importance of having students understand both, so that they can see that, hey, your story may not be corroborated by academic research, but it doesn't mean that it's not valid. You have this everyday scholar or researcher perspective that can really show, in some cases, what I'm missing, and I can show what they're missing, and we can find common ground to make a much bigger picture. And that gets at that wonderful, I think, the wonderful points that Dr. Childs just raised, and I'll stop there.
Great, thank you. I think that segues nicely into the next question, thinking about the academic gaze and the ways in which that can portray and how we conceptualize these identities. And the question is, would you please comment about the dichotomous ways in which Native Americans and African Americans are conceptualized as two ends of a spectrum in terms of relationships to place, and therefore are either romanticized or invisibilized in terms of issues such as conservation or environmental stewardship? Given the existential crisis of climate change, would you share a little about how people with your intersectional identities both push back on these stereotypes or tropes and offer insights for a way to care for the planet?
You want to go over that?
Okay, yeah, this actually relates to something Mr. Lang talked to me about yesterday. And I'm going to say one of the ways in which this address of climate can occur is something I challenge everyone to do. And I'm going to draw from my colleagues, Dr. Hoover, who's at Brown, and the awesome Melissa K. Nelson, who is at SF State. And that is to revitalize your foodways. And it's in the intersections of revitalizing foodways, you can actually begin to see how you can limit your carbon footprint in terms of what you need from a store, in terms of what you need in order to feed yourself, in terms of also, you know, the types of chemicals you don't buy by virtue of engaging these practices. And I hate to sound like Booker T. Washington, but he did have a point. If you come from people who were highly agricultural, then revitalizing those lifeways can give you the tools to really address, especially where not far from where I live, you have food deserts where there is no supermarket. People who have high rates of obesity and high blood pressure, et cetera, that's all related in many cases to diet. And I think in sharing, especially something that happens here, I think a lot in the Bay Area, especially in one communal garden in Oakland, you see where the blending of Native traditions, I'm not sure what the tribal affiliation of the families are, and African-American agricultural practices really enable people to have fresh produce in an area that doesn't have access to it. They can provide their children with life skills to supplement their foodstuffs so they're not spending all of their money at a grocery store for high-priced processed foods. And I think in doing that, you eventually over time can offset your not only your carbon footprint, but also improve your health and also improve your knowledge of the lifeways that were very useful, not only for your ancestors, but are still relevant today. I think one of the best examples of this can be seen where Dr. Childs' folks are, as well as down at Tonatham, where individuals have revitalized their lifeways and foodways in relationship to agriculture, and in some cases, decreased their obesity rate profoundly. They've reduced high blood pressure. They've also, in many respects, because they're not going to, leaving food deserts to go to grocery stores, they've reduced their carbon footprint. And these are small and actually, I find, culturally exciting ways in which people can engage through that action that Dr. Childs pointed out to address these concerns. So I'm going to stop here because I could go on for quite some time. And Mr. Lang, I'll email you the rest of my statement later. But then I'll turn it back to Dr. Childs.
You said it right to the point.
Let's see the next question.
So I believe I have the next question. And so this one is to shift us to a little bit and to offer a little bit of insight for folks who don't have the experience with a more blended family and their understanding. So they're asking if either of you have any knowledge around freedmen of the 5 tribes and those experiences in which, in which some people are African descended but are Native American because their ancestors were slaves, enslaved folks to indigenous slaveholders rather than being blended. Instead, those identities and struggle come from a violent history of child slavery and continued racism and a denial of citizenship. So this is going a little bit more into that the point we were getting into earlier, but please elaborate if you can.
I'll jump in. Okay. I was going to say Dr. Tell take this one, but I really like this question. And I think this is where a lot of the skepticism from African Americans comes into play about whether or not their relative was Native. When we talk about freedmen of the 5 civilized tribes, we're dealing with two populations of people. One group that actually, as a totality, they were former slaves, but one that was eventually absorbed because those individuals intermarried with Native population and their children became Native. Another population, which is really what we see in the media today, those who were marginalized and actually married, and some of us will think about Black Wall Street, hopefully, after I say this in a different way, who intermarried with what were referred to as state Negroes. And these were people, especially in late 1800s between and up till about 1940, that were moving into the state of Oklahoma after statehood and intermarrying with descendants, freedmen descendants of the 5 civilized tribes. And these are the individuals whose children are asking not for a handout, they are asking for an honoring of the Treaty of 1866, which gave all the former slaves, the United States required American Indian nations who owned slaves to adopt their slaves into the nation. The only group that really rejected outright were the Chickasaw. And if you read in forgot to mention Oklahoma Archives, wonderful people, incredible resources. If you read their pleas to the nation, you can begin to see when, where, and in what context they were Chickasaw by blood, either through rape or forced breeding. Chickasaws by culture, language, food, religion, especially because they worked in the homes of Chickasaws, and when they, for example, just refused to like Chickasaws because they were having the same slave experience that other slaves described, for example, with white America. And so these are individuals who, and largely, as Daniel Littlefield pointed out, have been reduced to a people without a history. And they are without a history because when individuals invalidate a treaty, they also invalidated the rights of the people, and to some extent didn't acknowledge their existence. And especially for Chickasaw freedmen, for example, they are people without a country. The Chickasaw Nation does not want them. The United States does not adapt them. And so they're just ex-slaves living in the United States. This is the same condition that you saw, for example, in Louisiana, Mississippi, Georgia, where individuals who were freed and just left to their own devices. And this is really important for folks to understand. So when these freedmen are talking about their experiences, they're really getting at a core that I think all of us share in the Western Hemisphere as Americans. And that is the extent to which we have negated the servant classes that enabled economic success over time. This is very important, especially for the 5 civilized tribes: Choctaws, Creeks, Chickasaws. The last were Seminoles, and Seminoles are a little different because they came in different waves. But if you look at how these folks recovered after removal, those holding slaves largely recovered within 10 years to their former state because of the slave labor. Slave labor, especially for full-bloods who owned slaves, they did the same work and were able to recover quickly. White and Native mixed bloods who owned slaves and plantations recovered much faster. And this is what these individuals are really, their words not only embody this history, but they also should inform and encourage us to study what happened to them. So when we think of freedmen and who they are, let us put them on par with the ex-slave of the United States. But know that culturally, they were not slaves of European Americans. Their culture, their language, their lifeways were indelibly linked, just like the slaves in the United States were indelibly linked to the nations who once owned them. And hopefully we can reconcile our consciences to the fact of their existence. Now, whether or not the government decides to ratify or uphold the treaties of 1866, and we're seeing that happen slowly over time with the Cherokee, et cetera, is, for me, that's not the question. The question is, did that change who they were? And does that kill the history they embody just because someone says a treaty is invalid? And I challenge all of us as Americans to think about that. And you know, I got to experience Obama. but I grew up at a time that I experienced some of the things my parents said about Jim Crow and racism, but not to the degree that they did. And I know my niece, for example, she grew up at the era of Obama. She does not have any understanding of the racism that people can put forward. And I challenge all of us to think about it. Has that racism stopped? And because it hasn't, has it changed who we are? Do we still not have that history that we embody as descendants of slaves, of descendants of individuals who've been denied time and time again? And what can we learn from individuals asking us to rethink that negation?
It's a very rich history, very rich. The poverty of the people is counterweighted by the richness of the history itself. And I hope that you all have the chance to work on that and bring your words to work in the world.
So I would encourage also, get in touch with the Freedmen Descendants of the Five Civilized Tribes organization. They're a wonderful group of people asking these kinds of questions, engaging the genealogies. And one of the things that we're finding is that their memories corroborate, in some cases, the historical record, meaning that there's a notion that, oh, slavery, and I'll evoke my inner Celia Naylor on this, slavery among the Cherokees and other people was easier. and then we hear from descendants that no, there are examples of rape and forced breeding, as well as love, which we don't like to problematize in this time or era of human exploitation. And we come to find out in the historical record, all of these are true because slave owners kept diaries, whether they were white or native, or then this will bust your bubble, as with the Créole gens de couleur, they actually were black and they owned slaves and purchased slaves. So this is something I think, especially for the freedmen, to really dig into and catch them before their elders are gone, because much of this history is not written. I'm trying to catch as much as possible. But I think what the Freedmen organization is doing, I think what a lot of the people like Ms. Van, for example, is doing, Ms. Grayson, even Eli Grayson, who is not a Freedman, but he's really working on this, really are getting us to think very critically about adding this story, like Abel did in American Indian, a Slaveholder and a Secessionist. American Indian slaveholders as part of the larger story of slavery in the United States. And that the slaveholder didn't necessarily look like Gone with the Wind. They might look like the person, like the Mr. Van and Mr. Mays. They may look like the American Indians dressed in suits that are part of somebody's imagination, when in reality, they weren't imaginary, they were real.
Thank you so much for your thoughts on that.
I
Going
talk
back
too
to
much,
kind
I'm sorry.
Oh, it's fine. Great to hear from both of you. So segueing into our next question, what are some scholars or activists or community leaders in your field that would be helpful for all of us to know about?
Dr. Childs?
Well, I certainly would go back to the late and great Jack Forbes. He's still here with us through his monumental amount of work and the great detail and depth of it. So I would say he's a good place to start. Jack D. Forbes, Africans and Native Americans. One book, but he did a lot of work, and so I would suggest him as a great resource and starting point.
I agree. I'm going to say Dr. Childs, but I have a laundry list. There's A.F. Chamberlain, Melville Herskovitz, Zornil Hurston, Carter G. Woodson for the area of history, Bruton Berry and Dr. Childs for sociology, for more contemporary, Andrew Jolivet, especially if you're interested in Creole phenomenon. I would say, especially for the voice of the Black diaspora in Indian country. You mentioned Sharon Holland, but I got to mention Taya Miles. And she will probably look at me and go, don't do that. But one of the things that her work does, just like all of the others, is it forces us to think about the lives that have informed research over time. And especially for the Black diaspora, that it is so varied. It's not just about Europe and European impact, to draw from Jack Forbes's point when he started his early works. It's really about the breadth of the African diaspora in that which we refer to as Canada, United States, Mexico, Central, South America. And what that can do for us, and I did Central and South America because I wasn't going to name all the countries, but what that can do for those who are really fascinated about this area of work is not only connect you with the historical, but also I think Dr. Childs and Dr. Forbes embodied is the transition through to more contemporary analyses that are capturing in some cases the concerns of young African Americans who are really thinking about this question of what are the Native origins or the amalgamation that of Native Americans that African Americans embody, some African Americans embody. And then also for American Indians, and I'm gonna draw from Judy Curtis and Angela Gonzalez, what is this Black in American Indian? And what role does it have? And they ask that question not as a rhetorical one, but as one to really force American Indians to think about the breadth of sovereignty that has been ignored because we focus on what has happened to American Indians by the federal government and the American Indian response. Now that is very important, but it also leaves out, and this is where Vine Deloria is brilliant. Ella Deloria, especially in her study of East Coast Native folk for the Bureau of Ethnology, really got people to think about what did American Indians do? And the impact that American Indians had on African Americans. And if you are interested in just that question in terms of US culture, A. Irving Hollowell wrote a paper on that, American Indian cultural impact. And as I mentioned before, A.F. Chamberlain wrote the contribution of the American Indian to civilization. So that's a laundry list, which includes our my fellow co-panelists and others, but I think that's a great starting point for this phenomenon. It's a diverse breadth of perspective and not just one area. Oh, and Daniel Littlefield, sorry.
And you know, there's a very interesting and wonderful novel by Leslie Marmon Silko called Almanac of the Dead. That is, it's kind of controversial, but I love it. I love it. It's encyclopedic in its depiction of the cross currents of African Americans, Native Americans, whites, going back in time over centuries. It's a wonderful novel, and in some ways it's the literary version of Jack Forbes. So I would recommend Almanac of the Dead by Leslie Marmon Silko. There's another addition to this.
And I'll give one more push for a resource that I think is underutilized, and that is the tribal records of the nations themselves. The laws of Choctaws, Chickasaws, Creeks, many of those laws are both in the language and in English. And I would really encourage folks to dig into them because you can see exactly what kind of laws were enacted towards Africans or people of mixed ancestry. And that can give you a wonderful springboard into a much richer conversation where American Indian agency is the central focus of analysis.
Great. Thank you for sharing those resources for us. I've been just like writing down notes. We're approaching not quite the end, but we were wondering if you would both be willing to share some kind of more concluding thoughts on what we've been talking about today and anything that you wanted to address that didn't get brought up. It would be a great opportunity to do so.
Dr. Child?
Yeah, well, I've been thinking as we've been talking about Soledad Prison and the brothers, the multi-ethnic brothers in the Samanawat group. One time when I was talking with them, I mentioned that Soledad prison and Soledad, the town, are right along some major trade routes, indigenous trade routes. They went from Mexico up north to the east, where you find the trade in obsidian and shark's teeth and furs, just coming, just this tremendous amount of interaction, which, by the way, is something also that doesn't get talked about very much. Is there's a tremendous trade networks in the Americas. There's apparently connections between what's now Peru and Guerrero state, in the 1200s, 1300s, 1400s. So, but I was thinking about the men there. I said, look, you all are right here in the middle of what used to be major interactions among people, north and south, east and west. And you yourselves represent that because they were from all different areas. There were Southeast Asians from refugee camps in Soledad. There were Native Americans. There are whites, black, just a wide range who are interacting positively. And by the way, the brothers there created their own, after these classes, many of them became the teachers. The students became the teachers. They created their own class, Transcommunality, but they pushed it beyond anything I had thought about. They really rose to the occasion and went beyond it. And this is all in the context of being imprisoned, incarcerated. So there they were, stuck in a way, obviously, stuck in Soledad, but they were in the middle of dynamic histories of trade, interaction. And that's what I think of at the end of this wonderful discussion. That's the image that comes to my mind.
Yeah, concluding thoughts. I talk too much, but I'll leave you with one. And that was something we didn't talk about, and that's recognition. And I'm going to draw from Joanne Barker's work, and particularly what she shares in common with Jack Forbes. And that is this idea that recognition is changing. And I'm going to throw in Gonzalez's work as well as Tayak and Cortez on this as well. Because recognition changes, definitions of being and belonging changes. And so this is something I really would encourage folks to think about when they think of African and Native American contact. Because not only is it changing in the United States, as people immigrate here, and especially here in San Francisco, we have a large Peruvian population. The notions of Native American and African American are also changing and becoming more varied. There's also Colombian population as well. And they're bringing African and Native American contacts, either Afro-Aymara or Afro-Quechua, into this fold. And they are looking for recognition. And sometimes they meet with the same resistance that African Native American mixed bloods meet with other Native Americans or white and Native American mixed bloods. And what that can really encourage us to do is to think very critically about where we draw the lines of recognition. Who is recognized in one person's eyes and who's rejected in another? And that this is part of, I think, the excitement of being in the United States. We do this a lot, but at the same time, it shouldn't be at the expense of the history that people embody. And that in engaging this question, I really want to encourage people to, and this brings us back full circle to what I was mentioning earlier, to respect the histories that people embody, to really put oneself in the shoes of those folks and ask yourself, how similar are they to me and how different are they from me? And what can I learn from their experiences that can teach me about the importance of my own? Because the notions of African American, Native American are only going to get larger. And I don't see this as, consequential to the existence of Native Americans in the United States or African Americans in the United States. I see this as something that actually Carter G. Woodson, Montague Cobb pointed out. And it was actually a question, which I'll leave with you all. What will the descendants of both groups look like 50 to 100 years from now? What kind of phenotype will define the African Native American or the African American and Native American? And I ask this because one of the things that I think our squabbles represent today is our lack of address of those questions. So I leave everyone with that question and hope that doesn't bring conclusion. It motivates you to keep studying this phenomenon.
Wow. I can honestly say that this has been a truly remarkable and mind-opening event. Dr. John Brown Childs and Dr. Robert Keith Collins, we continue to be inspired by your work and your commitment to bridging and building community with rigor and compassion. On behalf of the ARC and the AIRC, thank you so much for joining us tonight, and for everyone who participated in this webinar. Thank you for your attendance. As Tiffany King stated, the stakes of this conversation are so high because the capacity for Black abolition and Native decolonization to remake life and all of its expansiveness on new terms.
Thank you.
It's been an honor. Thank you.
It absolutely has been. Thank you for your wonderful work.
Yes.
Your words to work in the world.
Absolutely. And I'll nerd out with every single one of you all after.
And for those of you who are in the audience, really thank you so much for engaging with us today. If you're interested in learning more about future events between both centers, the African American Resource and Cultural Center or the American Indian Resource Center, please follow us on social media or visit our websites. You can also sign up for our newsletters there.
Yes, and also tonight's event was funded by Measure 15, the Community and Resource Empowerment Measure. Because of that, we ask that you please fill out an evaluation so we can continue just making sure that our programming is meaningful and serves our communities well. The link for the evaluation is posted in the Zoom chat, if you will see, and will be emailed to you after the event as well. We want to wish you all just a wonderful rest of your Tuesday evening. Thank you for your time, and we hope this is an important conversation that'll just continue to show up in our respective lives. Yes.
Okay.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
And Professor Collins, we've got several people asking for resources that you were naming. I was trying to write them down, but at some point, maybe afterwards, we can.
Absolutely. I can send you a bibliography list. so you relax your hand. I saw you writing, and I was like, I can send that to you all.
Yeah, we'll probably summarize with an email tomorrow that is a little steps for them for the participants for filling out the evaluation, thanking them, and giving some of the resources that you've shared, both you.
Okay, great. I'll send that to you in the morning.
And for those who are still on, if you enjoyed this conversation and want to share it with anybody who wasn't able to make it today, this event was recorded and it will be posted online. So you can use the link to share it with family, friends, loved ones, and other stuff. So thank you.